King Henry I of England. A woman born not merely into privilege, but into the coils of destiny itself. The candle sputters, the wind groans against the stone tower walls, and somewhere, in the vast corridors of memory, a door creaks open. Matilda, a name etched in ink and fury. She was born in the chill of early February in the year 1102, swaddled in the finest linen, her cradle likely carved of oaken strength, set near a roaring hearth in Winchester, or perhaps in Sutton. The chroniclers don't agree, they rarely do. But they agree on one thing: she was no ordinary girl. From the moment she first opened her eyes that would one day narrow against kings and crack dynasties, she was not simply a daughter, she was an heir, a pawn. A storm in a silk veil. Her father, King Henry I, had many bastards, but only 2 children born of a crowned queen. And the son, his beloved, rightful boy, was doomed to drown off the coast of Barfleur when the white ship split open against the rocks. A single flicker in the night, and the king's future was swallowed by the sea. And so, with one boy lost to salt and tide, all eyes turned to Matilda. Imagine it being 11 years old, summoned from your studies, your prayers, your dollhouse of a world, to be told you are now the future of England. What did she feel? Did she understand? Could she? The halls must have whispered louder that day. Servants bowing just a little deeper. The gaze of her father, colder, more calculating. For now, her body, her womb, was no longer her own. It was a battlefield. A crown-shaped gamble, but before she could rule, she must be wed. Shipped off across the Alps like a precious relic in a golden chest, to Germany. She was 12. Her new husband, Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor. Stern, much older, a ruler molded by wars and excommunications. And now, this foreign child, this English rose trembling in snow, was his empress. What does a 12-year-old see on her wedding night? Beneath vaulted cathedral ceilings and iron candlelight, what does she understand? We don't know, but she would learn. Matilda was no passive bride. Within a decade, she stood beside her husband as co-sovereign, traveled with him through the fractured heart of Europe, witnessed the sharp teeth of power, tasted the bitter wine of betrayal and ambition. She learned languages. She negotiated truces. She commanded troops. She watched. And when Henry did win, she knelt at his bier, veiled in black and surrounded by silence did not shatter. She did not return home in shame. She returned as empress. But England was not ready for an empress. When her father summoned her back and declared before nobles that his daughter was to inherit the throne, many bowed. Many swore loyalty, but in their hearts a cold question twisted: a woman. The Anglo-Norman court was not built for female sovereignty. It was a world of swords, oaths, and blood, they said, should run from men into crowns, knit from wombs into cradles. Still, Henry pressed on, for what choice did he have? But kings do not live forever. And when death came for Henry I, it came quietly, but it left chaos behind. Matilda was far from England when the news arrived. Her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the throne in a blur of speed and charm. He was crowned while the realm still mourned. While Matilda gathered her forces, was she surprised? Was she enraged? Did she sit before a hearth, staring into the flames, and whisper his name with venom? Stephen, the name tasted like betrayal. And so began the war, not of kingdoms and banners, but of cousins, of thrones, of faith in bloodlines. A civil war that would crack the soul of England. The anarchy. Imagine years of winter without peace. Roads stalked by mercenaries, villages burned for a prince's favor. Children born beneath broken roofs as archers moved past their windows. Matilda would land on the southern coast with her half-brother Robert, her banner raised high. But England did not embrace her. She fought. She schemed. She won cities and lost them. She captured Stephen once, threw him into a dungeon dark and damp, but could not hold the crown. London turned on her. Her own allies faltered. Her voice, though sharp and royal, was not enough. Her enemies called her haughty, arrogant, unfemini. Was it ambition? Or was it survival? Was it pride? Or simply justice? In one haunting moment, they say she stood poised to be crowned, and the bells of Westminster fell silent. The people had risen, the streets flooded with opposition, and the crown vanished like fog. Years passed. She retreated, but she was never defeated. She would live on, not as Queen of England, but as the mother of the man who would be king. Her son, Henry, the same boy she had risked everything to protect. She carved a legacy through fire and ice through siege and sorrow it for herself. But for him, he would become Henry II, the first of the Plantagenets, and she, Empress Matilda, would be remembered, dimly, in the corners of chronicles. Often misunderstood, rarely celebrated, but never broken. Tonight, perhaps, we let her story unfold not with trumpet blasts or courtroom decrees, but in the hush between heartbeats. In the silent ache of a woman who nearly wore the English crown. A woman who stood at the edge of power and peered over its cliff, and did not flinch. Dim the lights, dear listener. Let the wind press against your window, and close your eyes, for we have only just begun. Carrying with it the scent of damp stone and faded parchment, and the whisper of another life begins to stir in the shadows. She was called Eleanor, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a name that rolls off the tongue like silk but strikes the soul like a blade. If Matilda had stormed the gates of power, Eleanor would walk through them crowned twice and carry the world behind her eyes. She was not merely a queen. She was a force of nature, a woman whose intellect burned bright in a world that preferred its women silent, soft, and forgotten. She was born in the warm heart of the South Aquitaine, a land of troubadours and towering cathedrals, of lavender fields and wine-dark rivers. Her childhood was wrapped in verses and strategy. Her father, Duke William X, was a patron of the arts and a ruler with enemies. He taught her not just how to read poems, but how to read men. When he died suddenly, she inherited everything. Aquitaine, one of the richest, most desirable territories in Europe. And with it, the eyes of kings turned toward her like wolves sniffing at the edge of a feast. She was 15. They married her to the King of France, Louis VII, a quiet, meply, pious, shy. He had not been raised to be king, but the death of his brother had thrust the crown upon him like a yoke. And Eleanor, fierce, clever, radiant, was a storm he could never contain. Their union was a clash of fire and ice. She, full of heat and opinion. He, cold and devout. And when the Second Crusade called them to the Holy Land, they traveled together. Husband and wife, king and queen, beneath blistering suns and into cities drenched in blood and prayer. But war does not reveal the best in men. It reveals the truth. And the truth was, they did not love one another. Some whispered that she had grown too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, that her presence in court was more than political, that she had become more queen of the East than of France. When she urged Louis to redirect the campaign, to defend Antioch instead of Jerusalem, he refused. Called her reckless. Imprudent. She turned her back, and when they returned to France, they were strangers. Their marriage was annulled. No son, no heir. And Eleanor, no 29, was free, but only for a breath, because just 8 weeks later, she married Henry, the Duke of Normandy, a man 11 years her junior. Restless. Ambitious. Brilliant. Dangerous. Together, they would found a dynasty. She brought Aquitaine. He would take England. And when his cousin Stephen, Matilda's rival, died, Henry claimed the throne. The crown passed from Matilda's blood to her son, and Eleanor became queen again. Not just of a kingdom but of an empire. From Scotland to the Pyrenees, from Ireland to the coasts of Normandy, they ruled more land than any monarch before them. But theirs was no fairy tale. It was passion and poison in equal measure. Henry was not faithful. Eleanor was not blind. She bore him 8 children, 5 sons, 3 daughters. Each one a thread of fate, tangled and pulled in every direction by politics, pride, and pain. And as the years passed, Eleanor watched them grow not into princes but into rivals. Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, John, they were heirs with too little patience and too much blood between them. And when her sons turned against their father, Eleanor did not stop them. Some say she encouraged them, some say she led them. A mother rebelling against her king. A queen standing with her sons. Imagine it, a council chamber lit by torchlight, maps scattered across a great oak table. The air thick with whispered promises and sharpened daggers. Eleanor no longer the radiant bride, now a lioness, hardened by time, still regal, still dangerous. But the rebellion failed. Henry crushed it, and Eleanor was captured, imprisoned in a stone tower, not for months, not for a year, for 16 years. The Queen of England, the Duchess of Aquitaine, locked away like a criminal, What did she think about as the seasons changed outside her window? What did she remember? Her children, her lovers. The golden sun of Aquitaine, the dust of Antioch. Was it anger that sustained her, or simply resolve? And then Henry died. His heart broken not by battle, but by betrayal. His favorite son, John, had turned on him. And it was Richard, the warrior Eleanor's lion-hearted boy, who inherited the throne. She was released. An old woman now. Wrinkled, perhaps, but not bowed. And still, she ruled. As regent, she governed while Richard crusaded. She negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, outwitted enemies. Her letters reveal a mind still sharp, still witty. Her sons feared her, respected her, needed her. Even John, the last and most reckless, wrote to her begging for guidance. She died at 82, in the quiet abbey of Fontevraud, where she is buried beside Henry. And near Richard, her life was a storm, a tapestry woven with love, betrayal, crowns, and chains. She was a woman who loved deeply, fought fiercely, and refused to be forgotten. So let us not forget her. Close your eyes, hear the rustle of silk, the creak of a throne, the pounding of hooves in distant fields. Hear her voice calm, commanding, echoing down the marble corridors of time. She is not a relic, she is a roar, and tonight she reigns again. The fire is low now, embers glowing faintly in the hearth of your mind. The air has stilled. Outside, perhaps, the rain begins to murmur, soft and endless, like a lullaby meant for the dead. And yet history stirs, because there is another queen waiting behind the veil. Her name is Isabella. They called her the She-Wolf of France. But names are weapons, and stories are battlefields. She was born in 1295, the daughter of Philip IV, King of France, known as the Iron King. His court was a place of cold marble and colder ambition, where mercy was weakness and affection, a trick of the tongue. Isabella grew not in warmth, but in shadows, learning early the silent choreography of power, when to bow, when to listen, when to strike. At 12, she was promised to Edward II of England. She crossed the Channel with a dowry of jewels and silks and expectations. The winds of the North Sea howled around her ship, a forewarning perhaps, or a benediction. She was a girl then, just a girl, but inside her, already, a quiet storm brewed. Edward welcomed her with pageantry, trumpets, feasts, banners waving like prayers. But in private, he looked past her to another. Piers Gaveston, his friend, his favorite, his obsession. History does not speak in clear terms. It hints, it murmurs, it trembles between what we know and what we cannot bear to admit. But Edward's devotion to Gaveston was dangerous. Political, reckless. Isabella Cleaver, watchful and neglected, took note. She endured the humiliation of watching her husband lavish titles and lands upon Gaveston, calling him brother, sweetheart, my other self. She endured the gossip of courtiers, the sideways glances of lords. And then she endured the stillbirths, the isolation, the silence. But queens do not weep in public, they wait. When the barons rose against Gaveston, Isabella stood still as stone. When Gaveston was captured and executed, run through and left in a field, Edward broke. But Isabella remained poised. Not in cruelty, in calculation. Because her moment had not yet come. They had children. A son, Edward, born beneath a veil of unease. And for a time, the crown sat heavy but stable. She rode beside her husband in processions. She smiled. She played the part. But Edward was a man who never learned it. After Gaveston, there was Hugh Dspnser. Another favorite. Another shadow between them. Dispenser was greed in human form, ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for power. With him, Edward turned tyrant. Lands were seized. Nobles imprisoned. Wives of enemies were starved in the Tower. The realm bled. And Isabella. She was queen, but a prisoner in her own court. Watched. Stripped of lands. Her household dismantled. Her allies exiled or dead. But she still had her mind. And her bloodline. France called to her again. In 1325, Edward, desperate to settle a conflict, sent her to negotiate peace with her brother, the French king. He thought she would return. She never did. In Paris, she reunited with an exiled English nobleman, Roger Mortimer. A man with sharp eyes and sharper scars. Their bond was swift, intimate, dangerous. Together, they plotted. What does it take for a woman to rise against her king? Not anger. Not revenge. Resolve. She crossed the sea again, but not as a bride. This time, she brought an army. Landing on the English coast in 1326, she marched not with swords alone, but with justice in her hands. The people welcomed her, the nobles flocked to her side. The nation, tired of tyranny, saw in her not treason but salvation. Edward fled. Despenser clung to power, but he was caught, dragged through streets, executed with a cruelty so fierce it echoed through the centuries. And Edward. He was deposed, a king no more. Some say he was murdered. Others say he wasted away, broken in body and spirit, in the cold shadows of Berkeley Castle, and in that silence Isabella ruled, as regent for her son. Queen Mother, Victor, survivor, for 3 years she held the reins of power. But power is a cold, restless beast, and soon her son came of age, Edward III, and he was not content to share the crown with his mother and her lover. Mortimer was arrested. Executed. And Isabella. She was spared, not for mercy, but for image. She faded from the court, cloistered in privilege, but stripped of rule. For the rest of her life, she wandered palaces like a ghost, well-dressed, well-fed, and mostly forgotten. And yet, she had done what no English queen had ever dared. She had led an invasion. She had unseated a king. She had ruled. They called her the she-wolf. A monster, a traitor, a seductress. But perhaps she was simply a woman who refused to vanish. A mother who chose her son over her husband. A queen who would not be quiet. Tonight, as the rain whispers against your window and the flicker of candlelight begins to fade, let her voice rise from the silence, not to haunt, but to remind, that even in a world ruled by men, there were women who watched, who waited, and who dared to bite back. Sleep gently now. There are more stories waiting in the dark. The night deepens, and with it, the hush of forgotten footsteps returns soft, deliberate, echoing down the long, cold corridors of time. The past is breathing again, not loudly, but like a secret pressed against your ear. Another queen waits, another name, half buried beneath centuries of silence, pushes gently to the surface. And of Bohemia. She came not as a warrior, not as a schemer, not as a storm. She came as peace, and yet peace has its own kind of sharpness. Quiet does not mean powerless. And sometimes the softest souls leave the deepest impressions. She was born in 1366, in Prague, a city of spires and mist, where stone cathedrals clung to the edge of the sky and the Vltava River carried dreams down its endless current. Her father was Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, her mother a Duchess of the Palatinate, and was royalty twice over, but still just a girl in the court of 1,000 ambitions. From the time she could speak, she was taught restraint, grace, diplomacy. Not for her own sake, but for the crown she would one day carry. At 13, her fate was chosen. She would marry a king she had never met, in a land she had never seen. England. It was a union of politics, not romance. The 100 Years' War with France had stretched into yet another generation of blood and ash. And England, weary of conflict, reached across Europe for allies. And was the offering. She was 14 when she arrived. London greeted her with suspicion. The people called her a useless bride. She brought no dowry, no gold, no great army, but she brought something rarer. Stillness. And kindness. She was not beautiful in the way poets preferred, but her voice was gentle. Her eyes intelligent. And her presence in court, while quiet, changed everything. She married Richard II. He was just a boy king then, 17, brilliant but brittle, wounded by power far too early. He had seen his father die in exile, his grandfather wage endless war, his court twisted by ambition and betrayal. He needed not a queen to rule beside him. He needed someone to see him. And did. They grew together not just as monarchs, but as people. She read beside him, prayed beside him, walked the palace gardens in the early morning fog. Their love, unusual in its gentleness, became something rare for their age, a true companionship. She taught him mercy, when revolts rose in the countryside, when the angry voices of peasants reached the palace walls and urged restraint. She pleaded for clemency, even for traitors, and Richard listened, not always, but often. Through her, he glimpsed a world not ruled by fear, and through him, she tasted the weight of kingship, the unbearable silence that comes with wearing a crown. But peace does not last in courts soaked in ambition. The barons hated her influence, saw her as a foreign leech. They mocked her bohemian ways, her soft speech, her faith in reason. She bore no children. And in a court obsessed with heirs, This was a quiet curse. Whispers followed her like shadows. She is barren, they said. She is cursed. Still, she smiled. Still, she served. She commissioned books to be translated from Czech into English. She opened the palace libraries to commoners. She became a patron of learning, of poetry, of prayer. And Richard. He adored her. He called her his North Star. And then just like that she was gone. In the plague summer of 1394, the sickness came suddenly, fever, blood, the rattle in the lungs. She died in the palace at Sheen, barely 28 years old. Her death hollowed him. He destroyed the palace where she had breathed her last, burned it to the ground with his own order. He wore black for a year. Refused to speak of her, refused to remarry. They say he changed after that, grew colder, more erratic, angrier. As if when she died, the last tether to his better self snapped. The realm noticed. Within 6 years, Richard would be deposed, betrayed, imprisoned, starved to death in a cold cell. But Anne's name never faded from his lips. She left no children, no heirs, no legacy written in blood. But she left something else. The memory of gentleness in a brutal age. A queen who believed that kindness could be power, that knowledge could be as strong as a sword, and love, real love, could soften a tyrant's heart. Her tomb lies in Westminster, beside Richard's, hand in hand. Stone fingers eternally intertwined. They are the only English royal couple buried this way. No grand speeches were written for her. No great battles fought in her name. But still she remains. In the hush between reigns. In the fragile hope that peace once held. So tonight, if you feel the breath of something warm and steady in the dark, if you feel the weight of sorrow softened by grace, it might be her. And not forgotten. Only quiet. And still, somehow, watching. The wind carries a colder note now, brushing softly against the stones of memory, sifting through centuries like fingers through ash. The voices have quieted, the fire is low, and yet one more woman stirs in the silence, cloaked not in velvet or silk, but in chains of expectation. And dread. Her name was Margaret. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, daughter of France, architect of war. She came into this world during a lull in the 100 Years' War, born in the spring of 1430 in the shadowed halls of Lorraine. Her father was a minor king, her mother a woman of fierce resolve. But it wasn't wealth or power that defined Margaret's childhood, it was tension. The sense that the world beyond her walls was shifting like cracked ice. She was sent to England at 15, a diplomatic gift tied with gold thread and papal blessing. Her husband, King Henry VI, a man of bloodline, yes, but little else. He was gentle, pious, bookish, prone to long silences and sudden spells of confusion. Some said he was a saint. Others whispered of madness, of a vacant throne occupied by a soul already lost in fog. And so Margaret crossed the channel not to marry a king, but to step into a void. She arrived to a realm fraying at the edges. The French lands of her new crown were vanishing. Nobles fought each other more than they fought the enemy. Parliament grumbled like a storm waiting to break. She wore a crown of gold, but beneath it, she carried something heavier, duty. She smiled, she curtsied, she danced at banquets, but she listened, she watched, and she waited. Because when Henry slipped, when his mind crumbled in the wake of a lost war, and dead sans Margaret did not, she remained. And in the absence of the king, the queen ruled, first through whispers, then through counsel, then through force. She appointed ministers, forged alliances, shielded her husband's weakness behind a wall of strength, and the nobles began to fear her. Not for scandal, but for power. What happens when a woman rules without asking permission? They called her ambitious. Vindictive. Arrogant. Foreign. The same slurs, recycled. A woman rising always offends the ones who think her place is lower. But Margaret had no time for shame. She had a throne to protect, and a son to defend. Edward. Born after years of waiting, years of rumor and cruelty. Some claimed he was not Henry's child at all, but Margaret knew, Sheikh knew, he was hers. Her legacy, her blood answered through his. And when the Wars of the Roses broke open like a wound, when York and Lancaster tore the kingdom into pieces, Margaret did not flinch. She led armies, rallied men, rode into battle. A queen with her son at her side and fire in her voice. Imagine it, a woman in armor, not in myth but in flesh, galloping through the mud of Towton and Wakefield. her banner lifted against the storm, her voice calling soldiers to their deaths and praying they'd find something better in it. She did what kings did, and they called her a monster for it. But the war was merciless. Her son grew into a prince of iron will and harsh ambition. But the Yorkists were cunning, relentless. Edward IV seized the throne, Henry was captured, and Margaret. She fled to France to exile. But even in exile, she schemed plotted aligned herself with old enemies. Promised blood for blood, throne for throne. And once more, she returned. This time, not in glory but in desperation. The Battle of Tewkesbury would decide it all. She rode into it with everything: her hopes, her name, her son. And she lost. Her son, Edward, was killed. Struck down, some say in battle, others say after. Beaten to death before her eyes. The last thread holding her to power, to future, to meaning. Snapped. They brought her to the Tower. She was not executed. They didn't need to, they let her live. Years passed. Quiet years. Her husband, Henry, was murdered, smothered in the Tower, they say, with his crown ripped from his dead brow, the Plantagenet flame snuffed out, and Margaret, she faded into the grey mist of French convents and borrowed chambers. No court, no riches, no family. Just silence. She died in 1408. No banners, no eulogies, just a whisper in a foreign land. And yet what a life she carved through war. A woman who ruled through fear, not because she was cruel, but because she had no other currency. A queen forged in fire, surrounded by men who mistook her survival for sin. Tonight, as you close your eyes, if you hear hooves on wet stone, or a voice calling commands in the dark, you may be hearing her. Margaret of Anjou, the queen who fought too hard to be forgiven. Too fiercely to be forgotten. The hour is late now. The world outside has quieted to a hush, windows fogged, branches tapping gently against glass, like ghosts asking to be let in. And through that hush, another name begins to drift through the centuries, not with fury or fire, but with the delicate melancholy of a song half remembered. She was Catherine. Catherine of Aragon, the first. The faithful, the abandoned. She was born under the golden sun of Spain in 1485. A daughter of Kings Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who united a nation and expelled a centuries-old empire. Catherine's cradle was carved out of victory, her lullabies whispered over maps and treaties. From the beginning, she knew what she was: a bride, a token of alliance between two empires. At just 3 years old, her marriage was arranged to Arthur, the English prince. She was a child promised to a future that was not hers yet, a pawn in a game of kingdoms and faith. She came to England at 15, her gowns heavy with embroidery, her tongue laced in Castilian, her eyes full of duty. The English court, grey and damp, must have seemed like another world, a world of fog instead of sun, of silence instead of music. But she was gracious, determined, a princess of Spain, daughter of the Catholic monarchs, and she was ready to be queen. Arthur was fragile, quiet, a boy wrapped in layers of courtly formality and illness. Their marriage lasted only months before he died, coughing and pale, in the damp cold of Ludlow Castle, and Catherine was left a widow. Alone. Foreign, young, her future fractured. And yet she did not return to Spain. She stayed. She waited. For 7 long years, she lived in England without a crown or a husband. Princess. Exile. Her letters speak of loneliness, of struggle, of the weight of uncertainty pressing against her every breath. But she was not forgotten. In time, eyes turned toward her again. Henry, Arthur's younger brother, brash, handsome, athletic, the embodiment of everything Arthur was not. And with the Pope's blessing, they were wed. At last, Catherine was Queen of England. She stood beside Henry as his equal, proud, regal, beloved by the people. She rode into battle in his name, gave speeches to rally troops, governed while he was at war. She bore him sons, but none survived. Only one child lived, a daughter. Mary. And though Henry once rejoiced at Catherine's wisdom and faith, his joy began to rot beneath the hunger for a male heir, because kings wanted sons, and Catherine, despite all her grace and piety, had failed to give him one, or so he believed. The years wore on. Her hair thinned, her beauty faded in Henry's eyes. And then came another, and Boleyn. Younger. Cunning. Sharp-tongued and ambitious. And suddenly, Catherine's world, her crown, her marriage, her identity began to crumble. Henry petitioned the Pope to annul their union, claimed their marriage had been cursed from the start. That she was never truly his wife because she had been wed to his brother. Catherine denied it, swore she had come to Henry's bed pure, swore their union was holy and just. She refused to step aside, refused to name herself anything less than queen, even when Henry cast her out, sent her to dusty castles far from court, separated her from her daughter, and married in defiance of the church. Catherine would not yield. She wrote letters to Rome, to her nephew, the emperor, to anyone who would listen. She signed her name, Catherine the Queen. Not once did she admit defeat. Not once did she call herself divorced. And as the world shifted, England breaking from Rome, her daughter declared illegitimate, her name erased from prayer still, she held her ground. Alone. Clinging to the only crown she ever asked for. And on a cold January day in 1536, she died in Kimbolton Castle. Not surrounded by court or children or peace, but with her head held high. They say her final letter to Henry was full of grace. She forgave him, blessed him, loved him still, even after everything. Even after being cast aside for another woman. Even after her name had become an inconvenience. What kind of strength lives in that kind of forgiveness? What kind of courage wears no armor? She had once been the daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom. She died in a stone room with cracked windows and no crown. And yet history remembers her. Not as a victim, but as a queen who would not bow. So tonight, as sleep gathers in the corners of your room, and silence settles like dust upon your chest, listen for her. Not in trumpets. Not in thunder, but in the quiet steadiness of a woman who never stopped believing in her right to be heard. Catherine. The Queen. Still, always, Queen. The night is deep now, velvet and endless, the kind of dark that presses against the windows and hums beneath your skin. The fire is only ember, the shadows have settled. And yet, the story is not done, because some spirits refuse to fade. Some footsteps echo louder the farther they fallen. Now, another queen, another woman, and Boleyn. Her name flickers like a flame in a draught, never quite extinguished, never quite at peace. History has reduced her to scandal, to seduction, to a crimson neckline and a blade. But she was more. She was always more. She was born around 1501, in the gentle hills of Norfolk, raised between the quiet manors of England and the glittering courts of Europe. Her father was a diplomat, her mother a lady of noble blood, and was no simple country girl. She was cultivated, multilingual, fierce-eyed and sharp-witted. She spent her youth in the Netherlands, then France, lands of art, elegance, and dangerous intelligence. She learned the game of court not in books, but in rooms thick with perfume and secrets. She knew how to walk without being heard, how to smile without promising, how to speak with a softness that could pierce. And when she returned to England, the court took notice. Not for her beauty wasn't considered a great beauty, but her presence. It was volcanic. Eyes followed her, whispers followed her, and then he followed her. King Henry VIII, he was already married, already crowned, already grown tired of Catherine, who could no longer bear him sons. But Anne was fire and thunder in a jeweled gown. She did not give herself freely. She said no, over and over. She demanded more. She demanded a crown. Henry wrote letters, dozens, calling her his mistress and friend, swearing he would have no other. He shattered the laws of church and realm to have her. Waited nearly 7 years, tearing his country apart, burning bridges to Rome, defying the Pope himself. And when the break finally came, when he was no longer a Catholic king but head of his own new church, Anne was crowned queen. Not quietly. Not modestly. With a golden procession through London, roses falling beneath her feet. But with that crown came peril, because to rise in a world like hers meant someone else had to fall. And Catherine's daughter, Mary, the once princess, had not gone quietly. Neither had the people. They hated Anne, called her a witch, a whore, a usurper, but still she stood tall. She laughed, she argued with Henry, she flirted with power the way she once had with kings. And then she gave him a child, a daughter. Elizabeth. It was not what he wanted, but it was something. She tried again, and again, but no sons lived. And where once Henry had seen fire in her, now he saw threat. She was too proud, too defiant, too clever. And Henry's gaze, so once fixed on her, shifted again. To Jane, same quieter woman, a simpler answer. Anne's enemies circled like vultures. Her own uncle turned his back. Her former allies went silent. And the king, he stopped writing, stopped visiting, stopped believing. In May of 1536, and was arrested. charged with adultery. With incest, with treason. The charges were lies, transparent, cruel. But it didn't matter. She was taken to the Tower. And there, in the same stone walls that had held queens and traitors alike, she waited. She wrote letters to Henry, pleading not for her life, but for justice, for truth. None came. She was tried. Condemned. And on a cold May morning, she walked to the scaffold in a gown of gray and red. Her hair pinned, her eyes calm. She knelt before the executioner, a swordsman from France, brought in specially for the task. And with one clean stroke, her head was severed from her body. Her lips moved after. Some say she was still whispering, still praying, still clinging to some last spark of life. And Boleyn was not the first queen to die by politics, but she was the first English queen to be executed, a crown placed upon her brow in blood, and taken away the same way. But what the king could not know is that in that final daughter she gave him, in Elizabeth, she planted a future so vast, it would eclipse them all. Anne's name was spat from mouths in her own time. But time favors the flame. She burns still, tonight. If you hear the rustle of silk in an empty hallway, or the sudden hush of a room when no one's entered, it may be her. Not the witch. Not the whore, but the woman who changed the world, one whisper at a time. The hours are long now, as if time itself has slowed to a crawl beneath the weight of so many vanished crowns and echoing footsteps. The night is thick, dreamlike, velvet black. And somewhere in the silence between history's breaths, another voice begins to stir, a voice long ignored, yet impossible to forget, once heard. She is Jane. Jane Seymour, the third wife, the quiet one, the chosen shadow who followed a flame. She did not arrive with thunder or scandal. She did not dazzle courts with fire or clever wit. She came with softness, with stillness, with silence worn like a veil. And perhaps that was why Henry chose her. After Anne's execution, barely a breath had passed. 10 days, just 10 days after the sword had fallen, and Jane became queen. Imagine the hush that followed her footsteps as she entered the halls of Greenwich Palace. Imagine the servants watching her, eyes averted, lips pursed. The walls still echoing with Anne's laughter, her fury, her final prayers. Jane stepped into a role soaked in blood, but she did not flinch. She was born of nobility, but not of royalty. A daughter of a knight, raised in the quiet elegance of Wolf Hall, among tapestries and hunting horns and women who knew when to speak and when to lower their gaze. She had served Catherine of Aragon, then in Boleyn. She had watched two queens rise and fall, and she had learned it. Jane did not argue. She did not provoke. She did not demand. She folded herself into Henry's will like parchment into flame, and he adored her for it. She was everything and had not been. Demure, obedient, serene. But to mistake serenity for weakness is to misunderstand the kind of strength she held. She knew what she wanted. A son, and so did Henry. It was the one thing Anne could not give him. The one thing Catherine could not give him. And the thing Jane Seymour promised with soft eyes and a quiet vow. The pressure must have been unbearable. Every courtier watched her belly, tracked her every step. Midwives hovered like hawks. The nation waited, holding its breath. The fate of a dynasty balanced on the thin thread of one woman's body. And then October 1537, after 15 hours of agony and sweat and blood, Jane gave birth to a boy. Edward, the son, the prince, the heir to everything. Henry wept. He called Jane his true wife, his perfect queen. But perfection often comes at a cost. And in Jane's case, it was her life. Just 12 days after childbirth, the fever took her. Childbed fever, common, merciless, a slow burning from within. The prayers could not stop it. The physicians could not cure it. And Henry, so quick to discard the women who displeased him, could do nothing but watch. She faded like a candle burned too long. Pale, still, gone. She had been queen for barely a year and a half. And yet, she succeeded where the others had failed. She gave Henry what he wanted most, a son. And so, despite her short reign, she was elevated and enshrined in his memory. Not the scandalous one, not the stubborn one, but the pure one, the good one. He would marry 3 more times, but it was Jane who was buried beside him. In the royal vault at Windsor, Henry rests next to her. Not Catherine, not Anne, Jane. What kind of love survives beyond death? Was it love at all, or simply legacy? Jane Seymour was never given the chance to rule, never lived to raise her son, never danced again beneath the golden banners of court. But in the briefness of her crown, she sealed her place in history, not with fire, not with fury, but with quiet triumph. Tonight, as you lie still and the dark wraps itself around you like a cloak, listen for her, not in storms, not in battle cries, but in the gentle hush of a woman who got everything she wanted, and paid the price. Jane, the silent queen, the final breath of peace before the whirlwind began again. The darkness is heavy now, deep and undisturbed, as if time has curled into itself, holding still to let history pass through. You may feel it, the quiet weight of sorrow that hangs between rains, the soft weeping of ghosts who have no more words, only memories. And from that hush, another figure steps forward, not draped in sorrow, but cloaked in calculation. She was Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife, the survivor, and though her marriage lasted less than 7 months, her name endures, for she did what few others could. She walked away from Henry, with her head still firmly on her shoulders. She was born in 1515, in the lowlands of what is now Germany. Her world was not one of English splendor or French sophistication. It was simpler, structured by Lutheran reform, provincial politics, and the quiet order of courtly duty, and was not educated in music or dance. She spoke no English. She was not trained in the art of flirtation or the subtle politics of seduction. She was, instead, useful. England needed an alliance. Europe was shifting again. The Catholic powers were growing bold, and Henry, now excommunicated, isolated, aging, was in need of friends and a wife. Thomas Cromwell, ever the king's servant, arranged the match, and was described as modest, kind, tall, and fair. A portrait was commissioned, painted by the great Hans Holbein himself. She wore a heavy gown, her eyes unreadable, her lips closed like a prayer never spoken. When Henry saw the painting, he agreed. When Henry saw her, he recoiled. History says he called her the Flanders mare. She did not speak his language. She did not charm. She did not dazzle. And the fire he craved, the flame that had once nearly consumed his kingdom, was not in her. But Anne was not a fool. She knew her worth lay not in passion, but in patience. The wedding went ahead. January 1540. The king grimaced. The bride smiled. But there was no love, no heat, no child. And within weeks, Henry wanted out. He had seen someone else, young, English, shimmering with youth and vanity. And so, Henry turned to his council. He wanted his marriage gone. But Anne had learned it from the bones of queens past. She did not argue. She did not beg. She did not claim to be pregnant, or holy, or wronged. She simply agreed. She wrote to Henry with respect, addressed him as her most dear brother, relinquished the crown without fight. And in return, she received something no other queen of his had been granted: freedom, a generous settlement, several manors, a steady income, and the title, the king's sister. She attended court as a guest, dined with her stepdaughters, received foreign visitors, rode in gilded coaches, and wore silks embroidered with Tudor roses, while another wife, Catherine Howard, took her place, and later lost her head. Anne, meanwhile, watched, quietly, safely. She outlived Henry, outlived Cromwell, outlived every wife who followed. She never remarried. She never sought power. But she lived in a world where queens were so often silenced or sacrificed. Anne of Cleves endured, with dignity, with grace, with something more lasting than beauty or passion sense. She died in 1557, at the age of 42. A guest of history, a witness to its cruelty. A woman who had stood at the edge of the blade, and stepped back. Tonight, if you hear laughter in the distance, not wild, but soft and knowing, perhaps it is hers. And the clever queen, the one who learned that sometimes survival is the greatest triumph of all. The night has ripened into stillness. The stars above seem dimmer now, as if even they are weary with watching. In this silence, deeper than dreams and older than memory, another queen emerges from the ruins of desire and fear. Young, radiant, tragic. Her name was Catherine Howard, the fifth wife, the rose plucked too soon. She was just a girl when her name first whispered through court, a flicker in silk, a smile behind a fan. She was born around 1523 into the powerful Howard family, noble by blood, dangerous by ambition. But her childhood was not noble. It was fractured, scattered. Raised in the home of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a house of many young women and too little supervision, Catherine's world was one of stolen glances, forbidden touches, half-whispered laughter in darkened corridors. She learned early how to smile through discomfort, how to laugh off shame, how to pretend everything was fine. When she arrived at court in her teens, She was dazzling, vivacious, graceful, full of light. She became lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. But it wasn't long before the king noticed her. Henry was nearly 50, Catherine, barely 15. He called her his rose without a thorn. He lavished her with jewels, silks, music. To her, he was a mountain of flesh and authority, once a golden prince, now swollen with illness, his leg ulcerated, his mood sour. But he was the king, and Catherine, young as she was, had been taught only to please. In 1540, they were married, and she became queen. The court adored her, the people celebrated. Henry believed he had found love again. He grinned at banquets, called her his joy, his salvation, his reward from God. But beneath the golden surface, shadows were moving, because Catherine carried with her not only charm, but secrets. Before the crown, there had been a boy, Henry Mannix, her music tutor, then another, Francis Derham, with whom she had shared more than whispers, promises, intimacy, perhaps even love. And now, in her glittering prison of queenship, there was yet another, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, handsome, familiar, dangerous. Did they meet in secret? Did their hands touch in the dark? Did Catherine, trapped in a marriage to a man older than her own grandfather, reach for something that felt like life? The records say yes, but records are written by survivors. The truth is softer, sadder. The queen was watched, the rumors spread, and the king, once smitten, turned cold, very cold. The investigation was swift. Interrogations, confessions, betrayals. Catherine was arrested at Hampton Court, dragged from her chambers screaming, begging Henry to listen, to forgive. He refused. He would not see her, not once. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London, alone, terrified. She had never known war, never ruled, never challenged kings or courtiers. She had only wanted to be loved, but that was her sin. And in February of 1542, she was led to the scaffold. Barely 19, dressed in black. They say the night before, she practiced placing her head on the block, again and again, to ensure she would not tremble. And on that morning, she said only this: "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Then the axe fell, and another crown rolled into the dust. Another girl chewed up by the machinery of men's desire, politics, and pride. A child made a symbol, a bride made a warning. Catherine Howard was not a great ruler, not a schemer, not a saint. She was simply too young, too bright, too fragile for the cruel theater of the Tudor court. Tonight, if the silence feels a little sharper, if the wind through the trees sounds like the rustle of silk fleeing down a hallway, listen closely. It may be her, Catherine, the queen who never stood a chance, gone too fast, but never truly forgotten. The night is ancient now, older than memory, older than grief. It clings to the edges of your breath, a soft weight in the air, as though the walls themselves remember. And from the silence, one last wife steps forward, not with fire, nor fear, but with the weary grace of someone who learned how to survive by watching others fall. She was Catherine Parr, the sixth wife, the last, the one who outlived the king. She was born in 1512, the daughter of a courtier and a lady-in-waiting, her world shaped by service, not splendor. And from the beginning, Catherine Parr understood one thing more clearly than most: how to endure. She was twice widowed by the time she was 30, married off young, as noble women were to men decades older than her. She buried both, quietly, with dignity, and she carried on. She had not expected a crown. She had not sought a throne. She had fallen in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane, a dangerous man, handsome, ambitious, a familiar flame. They had planned a quiet future, a life beyond court. But then Henry called. He was older now, broken in body and mind, swollen with pain, suspicion, and regret. 5 wives buried or banished, his legacy still uncertain. His eyes turned once more to the safety of marriage. And Catherine was wise, educated, gentle, devout, patient. She was not a threat. She would not burn. So in July of 1543, she married the king. She became Queen of England, stepmother to 3 royal children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and nursemaid to a dying dynasty. And she ruled not with fire or seduction, but with intellect. She was fluent in Latin, French, Italian, and Greek. She published books of devotion under her own name. The first English queen to ever do so. She wrote of faith, of suffering, of salvation. Her words, quiet but firm, were read in homes across the kingdom. She became more than a wife. She became a mother to Elizabeth, offering her not just affection, but but education, philosophy, books. They would write to each other long after the crown passed. But even Catherine, calm and careful as she was, could not entirely escape danger, because her mind was sharp, her faith Protestant, reformist, bold, and her voice too wise for some. She debated theology with the king, questioned the teachings of old priests. And in a moment of paranoia, Henry ordered an investigation into her. They came for her. The warrant was signed. The Tower waited. But Catherine, brilliant Catherine, fell to her knees before the king and wept, not with fear, but with strategy. She told him she was only ever his humble student, that she questioned the scriptures only to better understand his wisdom, that she had spoken only to be corrected by his divine knowledge. And the king believed her, or needed to. The warrant disappeared, and Catherine Parr remained queen. She watched him fade. Henry died in 1547, consumed by rot and paranoia, the last of his fire guttering into silence. And Catherine Queen no longer was free. At last, she returned to her true love. She married Thomas Seymour in secret, laughed again, danced. For a moment, perhaps, she felt the life she had always postponed beginning to bloom. And then, she discovered she was pregnant. She was 35, and in a world where childbirth was a coin toss with death that mattered, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary. But the fever came, the pain, the slipping away. And in September of 1548, Catherine Parr, the quiet scholar, the gentle stepmother, the queen who had survived it all, died. Not by sword, not by scandal, but by the same silent fate that claimed so many women before her. And the man she had finally married, he moved on quickly, tried to seduce young Elizabeth. He, too, would meet the axe. But Catherine's story never vanished. She was the final chapter in a bloody book. The full circle, the woman who watched queens rise and fall and chose another path. She did not burn. She did not run. She stayed. She learned. She endured. Tonight, if the stillness in your room feels filled with unseen words, gentle, thoughtful, patient, you may be hearing her. Catherine Parr, the last wife, the survivor, the one who left not in pieces, but whole. The night is nearly complete now. A soft, silver quiet spreads across the world like breath on glass. You might feel it, a weightless hush that settles not only in the air but in the bones of memory itself. And yet, even now, the story moves forward, no longer among queens defined solely by crowns, but by the shadows behind them, women born in waiting, raised in silence, shaped not by their own desires, but by the ambitions of others. And so we arrive at her, Mary Tudor, Mary the First of England, a daughter who became a queen. A girl who learned far too early how cold the world could be to a child born of a broken marriage. She was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, born in 1516, in a court still golden with promise. The king's firstborn, the hope of a Tudor future. And for a while, she was adored, treated as a little queen in miniature, tutored in languages, philosophy, and theology. Fluent in Latin by the age of 9, precocious, curious, devout. But everything changed when in Bullen rose. Suddenly, her mother was cast aside. Her own legitimacy stripped away by a stroke of her father's pen. She was no longer a princess. She was a bastard. And she was forced publicly, bitterly, to recognize Anne as queen. To call Elizabeth, Anne's child, her equal, or face exile, or worse. She refused. Again, and again, and again. She would not betray her mother. She would not deny her birth. And for her loyalty, she was punished, banished from court. Separated from her mother, whom she would never see again. Stripped of her household, her status, her safety, she fell ill, isolated, afraid. And still she endured. She survived her mother's death, survived Anne's execution, survived Henry's shifting moods and endless remarrying, survived Edward's cold reforms and Jane's brief flame. She watched, waited, learned. When the time came when her younger brother Edward died and another was placed on the throne, Mary rose, not as a whisper, but as a reckoning. She rallied nobles, soldiers, the common folk, who still prayed in Latin and remembered her mother's rosary. She marched on London and was crowned its queen, the queen. Not by marriage, not by gift, but by blood. The first woman to wear the crown in her own right. It should have been a triumph. But the years of loneliness had hardened her heart and narrowed her trust. Her marriage to Philip of Spain alienated a country that already feared the return of Catholic influence. And then, the fires. 300 heretics burned at the stake. Not because Mary was cruel, but because she believed, fiercely, completely, that the souls of her people could only be saved by restoring the old ways, the old church, the old order. But belief, when twisted by grief and power, can become something else. And the joy that once welcomed her turned to dread. Phantom pregnancies only deepened her sorrow. The heir never came. Her body failed her. Her people failed her, or maybe she failed them. She died at 42, tired, unloved, and eclipsed. Replaced by the sister she once tried to keep in the shadows, Elizabeth. And yet, in her final moments, she remained the same girl who had once clutched her mother's hand and refused to bend. Tonight, if you feel the air grow colder with quiet conviction, or hear the echo of a prayer long forgotten, it may be hers. Mary, not the monster, not the martyr, but the daughter, who would not be erased. The night has turned inward now, no longer merely dark, but deep, endless, almost sacred. A velvet stillness hums beneath your skin, and the weight of centuries presses just lightly enough not to crush you. We've walked through fire and fear, through crowns and executions, but now, we come to her, Elizabeth Tudor, the last of the line, the girl who watched the others fall and learned how not to. She was born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, the daughter crowned in uncertainty from her first breath. Her mother's fate would become her inheritance. Barely 3 years old when Anne was executed. Declared illegitimate, hidden from court, raised not as a princess, but as a whisper. And yet, she listened, she learned. Where her sister Mary had clung to faith, Elizabeth clung to silence. She mastered the art of caution, of watching without speaking, of smiling without revealing a single thought. She grew up surrounded by daggers veiled as glances, alliances forged and shattered in a single breath. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, taught her not just languages and literature, but how to survive a world ruled by men. And when her father died, she did not rise. She waited. Through Edward's reign, she remained still. Through Mary's fire, she remained cautious. Even as her sister's eyes burned with suspicion, even as spies crept into her letters and her servants vanished one by one, Elizabeth did not flinch. She was imprisoned in the tower once. The same cold stones that had held her mother now closed around her. She walked the same haunted corridors, knew the same fear, but she lived. Because unlike so many before her, Elizabeth understood the game. And then Mary was gone. The people, bitter, exhausted, desperate, turned their eyes to the last Tudor child. And so, in 1558, Elizabeth was crowned. At just 25, she took the throne of a fractured nation, bankrupt, divided by religion. Surrounded by enemies, drenched in the blood of queens, she stood beneath gray skies with a crown far heavier than gold. And she bore it with something more than pride. She bore it with will. They expected her to marry, to step aside, to hand the power to a husband, as women were meant to do. But Elizabeth, daughter of Anne, daughter of thunder, refused. "I am already bound unto a husband," she said, "the kingdom of England." She would never marry. She would never share her throne, and so began a reign like no other. She navigated wars, assassinations, rebellions, and betrayal. She danced with diplomacy like a mistress plays a harpsichord, never off key, never rushed. She faced the Spanish Armada, the might of Catholic Europe, and survived. She outlived plots, popes, lovers, friends, and she ruled for 44 years. The Golden Age, they called it, but gold is forged in fire. She was not without scars. She knew loneliness intimately, knew what it meant to dismiss the man she loved, Robert Dudley, because the crown required it. Knew the silence of night in chambers where no laughter dared echo too long. Knew that every smile was measured, every word weighted with consequence. But she endured. And more than that, she shaped the world. She made herself myth, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, not because she was without desire, but because she gave her body to history and her soul to survival. When she died in 1603, she was 69 years old. Alone, exhausted. The end of the Tudors. The end of a dynasty born in battle and bathed in blood. But what remained was legend. Tonight, if you hear the rustle of silk and the creak of distant floorboards, do not be afraid. It may only be her, Elizabeth, the last flame, the daughter of the axe, the queen who wore solitude like a crown, and ruled a world that tried, again and again, to silence women like her, but could not. The night is no longer just still, it's sacred. The kind of silence that feels like it's listening. Every breath drawn now carries the weight of what has been spoken, and what is still to come. We have followed queens through fire, betrayal, birth, and blade, and now we leave the court, but not the crown. Because the blood of those women did not vanish with them. It echoed forward, slipping into new hands. And in one distant castle, far from the English throne, another woman was born beneath the shadow, Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots. She came into the world in 1542, as winter tightened its grip on the Scottish Highlands. Her father, King James V, died just 6 days after her birth. And so, she became queen before she could speak, before she could walk, before she even knew what a crown meant. A cradle queen, an infant monarch in a land divided by clan and creed, by ancient loyalties and fresh wounds. Scotland was not England. It was wilder, more fractured. Its hills soaked in the old ways, its courts rougher, its tempers hotter. And Mary, this delicate child wrapped in linen and legacy, was never truly safe there. By the time she was 5, they sent her to France, to be raised in elegance, to be promised to a prince, to be made into something useful. And in France, she bloomed. She was intelligent, curious, magnetic. Her beauty was legendary even in youth, tall, graceful, with auburn hair and eyes like stormlight. She spoke French, Latin, and Italian. She wrote poetry, she danced, she charmed kings and poets alike. And at 16, she married Francis, the Dauphin of France, a girl queen. Again, when he ascended the throne, she became Queen of France. And for a moment, she was untouchable. But moments pass. Francis died just a year later. A fever, sudden, brutal. And Mary, still barely 17, was once again a widow. France no longer needed her. And so she returned to Scotland, to a country she hadn't seen in over a decade. A land she barely knew. A crown that waited not like a gift but like a test. The Scottish nobles did not trust her. She was too French, too Catholic, too refined for their brutish court. They watched her, measured her, whispered about her in smoke-filled halls. But Mary was not weak. She was a queen who had ruled, a woman who had suffered. She entered Edinburgh not as a frightened exile but as a sovereign returned to her own throne. And yet, even her grace could not tame the storm. Her second marriage to her cousin, Lord Darnley, was a disaster. He was vain, jealous, violent, and worse, ambitious. He wanted her crown, and when he feared he wouldn't have it, he struck. He and his conspirators murdered her friend and secretary David Rizzio right in front of her, in her own chambers, while she was pregnant. He held her down, watched the blade fall again and again into her friend's body, and still she gave birth to his son, James. But by then, something had broken. Soon after, Darnley was dead, blown up in a house outside the city. His strangled body found in the garden, and suspicion turned toward Mary. Whether she ordered it, or merely allowed it, the damage was done. She married again too soon, too recklessly, to the man accused of killing Darnley. The Earl of Bothwell, her captor, her lover, her mistake. Scotland rebelled. She was forced to abdicate, imprisoned, exiled, and so she fled, to England, to her cousin, to Elizabeth, to sanctuary. But sanctuary is a fragile word. Mary was a queen without a throne, a Catholic in a Protestant land. A living claim to Elizabeth's crown, and so she became a prisoner. Not for days, not for weeks, but for 19 years. Locked in castles, moved like a shadow from one estate to another, treated like royalty, watched like a criminal, and always there were plots, some real, some imagined. Her name was used like a sword by Catholic rebels and foreign kings. Whether she knew of them or not, her presence was danger. And finally, it was too much. In 1586, letters were intercepted. A conspiracy to kill Elizabeth. To place Mary on the throne. A trap, some say. A mistake, others claim. It didn't matter. The axe was waiting. On February 8, 1587, Mary Stuart, dressed in velvet red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. She walked to her death with a grace that silenced the room. She forgave the executioner, prayed for her cousin, kissed the crucifix. It took 3 strokes to sever her head. And even then, her little dog, hidden in the folds of her gown, refused to leave her body. Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman born to rule, crushed beneath the weight of 2 kingdoms and 1,000 suspicions. Tonight, if the wind carries a song you don't recognize. Soft, foreign, unafraid, perhaps it's hers. The queen who died not for what she did but for what she was. The night now lies in still, breathless reverence. It has heard to many confessions, carried to many last prayers. The stars above feel faint and remote, like the distant eyes of ancestors who have watched it all before. And yet, we continue into deeper corridors of history, where the women no longer wear crowns, but wield something just as heavy, the burden of royal blood without the safety of power. Now we follow the child left behind, James's daughter, the girl who would become a symbol, a threat, a prisoner. She was called Lady Arbella Stuart. Born in 1575, in the quiet wake of Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, Arbella entered a world already sharpened against her. She was a descendant of both Henry VII and Margaret Tudor, her veins thick with Tudor fire and Stuart ambition. That made her dangerous, too royal to ignore, too royal to trust. Raised in the care of her grandmother, the formidable Bess of Hardwicke, Arbella's childhood was a cloister of obedience and high expectation. She grew up in the cold marble shadows of Hardwicke Hall, with its soaring windows and relentless discipline. Every lesson, every breath, was preparation for something that might never come. But others saw her future differently. To some, she was a spare heir to the English throne. To others, a pawn to be married off for foreign favor. To herself, she was just waiting for someone to decide what she would be. She watched Elizabeth grow older. Watched the Queen's childlessness become a question that whispered down corridors and into foreign courts. Who next? Who after? Arbella's name rose and fell with the tides of fear. She was kept under close watch, not quite a prisoner, but never quite free. A woman whose proximity to the throne was a shackle in disguise. She longed for autonomy, for affection, for escape from the cruel limbo of royal proximity. And then, in secret, in defiance, she reached for love. In 1610, at the age of 35, she married William Seymour. Another royal, another name too close to a crown. Their marriage was illegal without the king's permission, but they married anyway. And the storm came swiftly. Arbella was arrested, separated from William, locked in the Tower of London, the same tower where so many of her blood had vanished. She planned an escape, dressed as a man, smuggled onto a boat. For a moment, freedom was within reach, but she was captured before the journey could be completed. William escaped to the continent. Arbella was brought back in chains, and the tower swallowed her again. There would be no trial, no execution, no martyrdom, just silence, just fading. Alone in her cell, her mind began to slip. The confinement was not physical alone, it was spiritual. She was buried while still breathing, forgotten while still alive. Letters she wrote pleading for kindness, for mercy, for books, for light were either never answered or quietly shelved. She died in 1615, at 40. No crown, no grave with a name carved deep in stone. Just dust and sorrow, interred beneath the weight of dynasties that feared her very existence. Lady Arbella Stuart, a woman who had done nothing but be born into lineage like a curse, too noble to be ordinary, too threatening to be allowed freedom. And so, the child of queens was smothered by silence, not with blade, but with absence. Tonight, if you feel the cold breath of loneliness against your cheek, if the room feels too wide, too empty, you may be sharing space with her. Arbella, the forgotten heir, the royal without a realm, the woman history locked away and then left behind. The night is hollow now, vast and echoing, as though even time itself is holding its breath. Each story that has come before lingers in the air like fading incense, sorrow, defiance, longing. And yet, as we drift further into the past, something strange begins to happen. The grandeur recedes, the thrones are distant, the crowns grow dim, but the stories, they remain sharp, more human, more haunted. For what happens when a woman is born noble, but without the shelter of a crown? When she bears royal blood but has no armor of state, she becomes something else, something exposed. Frances Grey knew this all too well. The mother of the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey, queen for 9 days, pawn for a lifetime. Frances's name rarely stands on its own. Yet without her, there would be no Jane. And without Jane, the legend of lost girlhoods in Tudor history would be incomplete. Frances was born into privilege in 1517, granddaughter to Henry VII, niece to Henry VIII, a Tudor by blood. Bred in the furnace of royal closeness, from the moment of her birth, her life was measured in alliances. A woman to be married, to produce heirs, to secure power. She did all three. Married to Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, a man of rank but little patience. Together they had 3 daughters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary, girls, all of them. In a world that still saw girls as lesser, as leverage, But Francis had ambition, not the loud kind, not the kind that shouted in court chambers or raised armies. No, hers was a quieter, colder thing sharpened through proximity to power, molded by decades of watching queens rise and fall. She had seen her cousin Mary cast aside. She had seen Anne Boleyn executed. She knew what happened to women who thought too boldly, so she played a different game. She raised her daughters to be the image of virtue and discipline. Jane, her eldest, was a prodigy fluent in Greek and Latin before most children could write their names. Francis believed Jane's mind could be a crown sharper than gold, but it was never enough. When King Edward VI grew weak and childless, the question of succession ignited once more. And in the ashes of uncertainty, Francis saw her chance not for herself, but for her daughter. With the help of scheming nobles and her own husband, she allowed Jane to be married into the Dudley family. Allowed the idea of queenship to fall upon her child's shoulders like a burden wrapped in silk. She did not force it, perhaps, but she did not stop it. And then, when Edward died, Jane was queen. For 9 days, 9 days of silence and confusion, of plots moving faster than breath, of Jane barely 16 thrust onto a throne she never sought. And when the tides turned, when Mary Tudor reclaimed the crown, Frances did not weep. She did not fall to pieces. She begged. She pleaded. Not for the throne but for her daughter's life. In the end, she could not save her. Jane was executed. A child knelt in the Tower yard, reciting Psalm 51 as the axe rose behind her. And Frances? She returned to court, reconciled with Queen Mary, even remarried, choosing a man far below her station. Some said she had learned humility, others said she had learned survival. But beneath every gown she wore, every curtsy she made, lived the memory of Jane, the sound of her voice echoing in empty halls, the feel of a daughter's crown never meant to be worn, the knowledge that ambition, even second-hand, even in the quietest corners of a mother's hope, can still kill. Frances died in 1559, just 2 years after her daughter, her legacy wrapped in silence and shadows. History remembers her as harsh, as cold, as cruel. But perhaps she was simply exhausted. Perhaps she was just one more woman in a long, endless line pushed too close to the flame. Tonight, if the wind feels like it's carrying an apology you cannot quite hear, if you sense the sorrow of someone who would give anything to go back, just once, and choose differently, it might be hers. Frances Grey, the mother of a queen, the architect of a tragedy, a woman whose hands never held a blade, but still bore its weight. The night is nearly over now. Its long shadow softens. Its edges blur like the final lines of an old letter read too many times by trembling hands. What began as pageantry and power has become something quieter, more human, more fragile. We have followed queens into battle, into exile, into graves. We have sat beside them in towers, in palaces, in silence. And now, at the end of this long, dark path through history, we arrive at a place where no crowns gleam, no trumpets sound. Only one woman remains unburied by time, though largely forgotten by it. Her name was Catherine Grey, sister to Lady Jane, a girl raised in the same shadow, under the same roof, with the same legacy stitched into her skin like a thread she could never cut free. Catherine was younger, softer, less gifted, they said, less sharp, less political. But she had something else, something dangerous in its own right. She had a heart. She loved. And in the court of Elizabeth I, that was enough to destroy her. After Jane's death, Catherine and her younger sister Mary were left adrift, daughters of traitors, watched by the throne, tolerated but never trusted. Elizabeth never forgot the Grey claim to Tudor blood, never forgave the threat it posed. The crown may have rested on Elizabeth's head, but it weighed heavier with every woman near her who could bear a rival heir. So Catherine was kept close, but not too close, allowed to curtsy, to smile, to fade. And then, she fell in love, not with a foreign prince or a strategic ally, but with Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, a nobleman, yes, but no great political shield. They married in secret, with no permission from the Queen, a private joy, a forbidden vow. And the moment it came to light, everything shattered. Elizabeth was livid, betrayed, not just by the marriage, but by the possibility, no, the certainty that Catherine could now bear a child with a legitimate claim to the throne. And so, the sentence was swift, imprisonment, for both of them, torn apart, locked away. No trial, no appeal, just the sound of bolts sliding into place. But love, stubborn and delicate, found a way. Somehow, perhaps through bribed guards or whispered messages in the dark, Catherine and Edward saw each other again. And again. enough times, that she conceived. Twice, she gave birth to 2 sons within the tower's walls, boys who carried both the Grey and Seymour names. Boys born with claims so potent they were treated not like heirs, but like bombs waiting to explode. For this, Catherine was punished all the more. She was moved, separated, isolated. Her health began to fade, the tower grew colder, the walls grew tighter, and by 1568, at just 27, she was gone. No axe, no scaffold, just slow erasure. She was buried quietly in Yoxford Church. No monument, no legacy, only rumors, only regret. Edward, her husband, was eventually released. He remarried. He lived. But Catherine never left those stone walls. Not really. She became a ghost in the corners of Elizabeth's reign, a silent warning, a cautionary tale. Proof that even love could be treason when bloodlines were involved. Tonight, if the darkness feels gentler, if the quiet curls around you like a veil of breath and memory, it may be hers. Catherine Grey, a woman who did not seek a crown, who did not scheme or rebel, who simply loved and paid for it, not with fire, not with blade, but with everything else. And as this long journey comes to its close, remember her not as a footnote in another queen's reign, but as something softer, something lost, a final name carved into the long, cold wall of forgotten women who once wore royalty like a thread around their throat. Thank you for staying with me through the hush of history, through chambers lit by flickering candlelight and lives too often dimmed before their time. You've walked with queens and prisoners, lovers and mothers, survivors and ghosts. Their names may have faded from textbooks, but here, in this quiet space between waking and dreaming, they live again, not as symbols, but as women. If this journey moved you, if it made you think, or feel, or simply rest in a story long buried, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe, if you haven't already, so we can wander further down forgotten paths together. Let me know where you're listening from, what hour of the night or day finds you here. And if you'd like more of these calm, immersive stories, there is so much more waiting. For now, dim the lights a little more, let the silence carry you. And know that in some distant hall of memory, the voices we've heard tonight echo still soft, steady, and unforgotten. Good night, and thank you for listening.